Hi everyone, I'm Shelly and you're watching There's No Place Like Home. I'm back with another video and today's topic is, when did Jesus say he was coming? I know that many people are going to jump into the comments without watching the video to say that Jesus said that no one knows the day or the hour, and that is true. Jesus did say that. However, he did give his disciples a time frame to look for his coming, and that's what we're going to be focusing on today, mainly on Matthew 23 and 24. Now, this is the first in a series of these videos that I'm going to be doing on when Jesus said he was coming. And this is going to be focusing on what he said about this in the Gospels, what he said about this in Revelation, and we're going to see if we can hone in on the truth. Now, this video and the videos that I'm going to be doing that are related to this are based off of Glenn Hill's book, Christianity's Great Dilemma. Is Jesus coming again, or is he not? I did a video on chapter 1 last week. So this video, while it's going to be on chapter 2, is not going to cover all of chapter 2. It's only going to cover part of it. Now, before I even get started with the video though, last week when I did publish that other video about the book, someone left a comment saying that Glenn Hill at the time was in the hospital and that we should pray for him. And I appreciate the person who said that. So my question is today, if anyone is watching, if you have an update on Glenn Hill, because I'm not on Facebook, so I miss a lot. I didn't even know that Glenn Hill was in the hospital. So if you do know, if you know how he's doing, or any sort of update, I would appreciate it if you would leave a comment so that we can continue praying for him. But let's get started. The other day, I heard a pastor speaking about the pre-trib rapture. And in it, he was saying how he had seen that someone else posted on social media somewhere that the church would go through the tribulation, that they would not be raptured, that they would go through the tribulation. And he was saying that everything that he has seen is that the rapture is the Christian's great hope, which, I'll make a video about that in the future. I'm not going to comment anymore on that right now. But his premise was that no, that we are going to be raptured before any sort of tribulation. And as I was sitting there listening to this, I was I'm getting to the point where I don't understand how a pastor or someone who spends a lot of time in scripture could even wonder at all about this, because actually Jesus was very clear about when the tribulation would happen, when his coming would happen, and it doesn't match up with what either of them said, meaning the pastor or the person that he was speaking of. So, if you are familiar with the end of Matthew 23 and then also Matthew 24, you will probably know that Jesus, in the end of Matthew 23, in Matthew 23, he was in the temple and he was giving the 7 woes to the Pharisees. And at the end of Matthew 23, he began speaking to them about how judgment was going to be coming on them. We'll get to that. Then after they left the temple, Jesus and his disciples, they pointed out the temple and they said, "Do you see these things?" And then he told them, and again, I'm paraphrasing here, but we will look at the scriptures. He said, "You see all of this? All of this is going to come down. Not one stone will be left upon another." And so his disciples, they were, of course, shocked, and they were curious about this. And they asked him some questions that we're going to focus on today, because Jesus did indeed answer them. And what they asked him was basically when he would be coming back. So let's see what he said. First, we're going to go to Matthew 23:36. "Truly, I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. This particular passage, if we go back and read it, we will see that this was when Jesus was still speaking to the Pharisees, and he was telling them that they were going to have to face judgment for what they had done and for what their forefathers had done. In fact, if we read verse 35, it says, "And so upon you," meaning the scribes and Pharisees, "will come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I tell you, all these things will come upon this generation." He was speaking to the scribes and Pharisees. He told them that they were going to be facing judgment because of all the blood that had been shed all over the world, and that all those things were going to come upon their generation. He specifically said, this generation. And most scholars and most Christians would agree that Jesus was speaking to the Pharisees and that he meant their generation, contemporary to them. Now, Matthew 24 picks up right after that. As they were leaving the temple, after Jesus had said these things to the scribes and Pharisees, then his disciples, they had some questions for him. And we'll start with verse 1. As Jesus left the temple and was walking away, his disciples came up to him to point out its buildings. "Do you see all these things?" He replied, "Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." While Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. "Tell us," they said, "when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" I'm going to point out here that many translations, I think the King James is one of them, mistranslates the Greek word aeon and translates it as the word world. It is better translated as age. So if you read the King James Bible, it will say, "What shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world?" This is why so many people think that the Bible talks about the end of the world. But it should be, "What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" It's a very important distinction. Now, I'm just going to move down a little bit in Matthew 24, and we're going to read verses 30 to 35, because these verses help to answer their questions. "Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." First of all, let's notice that he told both the Pharisees, "This generation shall not pass," and now he said the same thing to the disciples when they asked him the questions about what will be the sign of the end of the age, what would be the sign of his coming. Now, I have a question for you. If you were sitting in the audience that Jesus was speaking to, if you were there, and if he said these things to you, what would you think? If Jesus was there and he said to you and some other people that were with you, "When you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." Now, if Jesus said those things to you, would you think that he meant you? Or would you think that he was talking about a future generation, perhaps a generation 2,000 plus years down the line? Now, if you're honest with yourself, I'm hoping that you will say, "Well, I would think that he was talking to me because he said you." Well, you would be correct. He said, "When you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates." Because there's a very simple, explanation for if he was talking about a future generation. he would have used the word they. So when they see all these things, they will know that he is near at the very gates. That's not what he said. He was talking to people who were standing there with him. And he said to them, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And you will hear so many different people give different excuses for what they think these words mean. Because people are so desperate to place ourselves, our generation, in the middle of prophecy. And our generation now is not the only one guilty of this. This has been going on for centuries, that people have been trying to place themselves into the center of prophecies, not really regarding the tribulation, because believing that the tribulation is future is a relatively new idea. But it's something called generational provincialism, where you believe that everything of importance is going to happen to you. And that is really where this comes from. And it's taking away from Christ's words. There are so many different excuses that people give because it doesn't fit their system. Because if they take Jesus at what he said here, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place, then they would have to admit that this is not going to happen in our future, or not going to happen to us. Well, that would still be our future. So it wouldn't be a near future for us. It wouldn't be a far future for us, because if they would take Jesus at his word, they would understand that he said this generation, meaning his. And just as I said, if he were talking about future people, he could say, when they see all these things, they will know that he is near. He also did not say, truly I say to you, that generation will not pass away. He could have, but he didn't. Why? Because I believe he was speaking to his own generation. That's why he said this. It's a near demonstrative pronoun. That means in close proximity to the speaker. This generation. Now, you will also have some people tell you, well, no, that actually means the generation that sees the signs. That's completely changing Jesus's words. That's not what he said. He said this generation. It was 2 words, this generation. He did not say the generation that sees the signs. Did he? Now, I decided to come back to Matthew 23. We were just in Matthew 24 when he told his disciples, this generation shall not pass away until all these things take place. In Matthew 23, that's what I read to you. And when he said to the Pharisees, truly I tell you, all these things will come upon this generation. And I want you to notice what else he said then. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those sent to her. How often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were unwilling. Look, your house is left to you desolate. So it was after Jesus said those things to the Pharisees, that their house was going to be left to them desolate, that his disciples were completely astonished, because the house was, in fact, their temple. And their temple was the center of their entire world. So here's a direct quote from the book. It says, this house was not only the very temple in which Jesus stood, but also everything Judaic, including all that was the house of Judah, their lives, families, land, nation, religious system, priesthood, and way of life. All of it, according to Jesus's words, was destined for complete desolation. So when I said to you that aeon was mistranslated in Matthew 24, you could say coming of the end of the world, not talking about the entire world that every single person on all 7 continents lives on, but their world would certainly come to an end, meaning the old covenant world. It is so important to also understand that when the Bible in general was originally written, there were no chapter breaks. And the chapter breaks were put in there by the translators to help organize it, to make it easier to read, maybe not to be so overwhelming. But at the same time, a lot of times the chapter breaks, they take away from what is actually being said because it places artificial breaks in between things that were actually continuous. And this is something that many people do when it comes to Matthew 23 and Matthew 24, for example. This is why there are so many people who are willing to say that when Jesus told the Pharisees that those things were going to come on their generation, they will say, oh yeah, he was talking to them about their generation. But then when Jesus said it just a little bit later to the disciples when they went outside, they say, oh no, he was talking about a future generation. And I think one thing that contributes to that is because people, they see this artificial break. Oh, well, it's a different chapter. It's a different time. It wasn't a different time. Jesus was talking about the same event from when they left the temple. He was telling the Pharisees what was going to happen. And then they continued outside. The disciples asked him the questions, when shall these things be? What shall be the sign of your coming? And what shall be the sign of the end of the age, or the end of the world, as some people think? Again, I'm going to emphasize that would be Old Covenant world. But it was all one event. It was not separate. So the question is, why would you consider this generation, when he was speaking to the Pharisees, to be their contemporary generation? But then when he said the same thing to his disciples, probably, I'm just guessing here, but a few minutes later, I don't know how long it took between them, but this is all one event. It's after they left the temple. And he said to them, this generation shall not pass until all these things take place. Why would the definition change? There is no good reason for that. I believe that the term this generation is used over 20 times in the New Testament, and every single time that this generation is used, it's speaking of the contemporary generation. So why would this one instance be different? In my opinion, the only reason that people consider it to be different is because if it's not different, then that means that their eschatological view doesn't work. Now, when we get back to the questions that the disciples asked Jesus when he spoke about when he spoke, did I say speaked? I actually said speaked. I sound like one of my children. When he spoke about the destruction of the temple, they asked him these questions, and there are many Christians who will say, oh, those are all completely unrelated questions. They're talking about different times. Well, they weren't. They were all related. So again, when shall these things be? Meaning the destruction of the temple. They're asking him, when's this going to happen? And then the second question was, what will be the sign of your coming? They immediately associated the destruction of the temple with Jesus's coming. Why? Because remember, these were Jews that Jesus was speaking to, and they knew that in the Old Testament, when God brought judgment upon a nation, it was often spoken of as him having come down and of his having arrived in order to execute justice. So this was a familiar concept to them. Now keep in mind that they were also there when he spoke to the Pharisees and told the Pharisees about their judgment. So they would have seen this coming judgment on the Pharisees, this destruction of the temple, and yes, so they would have associated that with Jesus's coming. And so then that brings us to the third question that they asked. What will be the sign of the end of the age? Or as, like I said, the KJV says, as the end of the world. Well, because they knew that if their nation was destroyed and left desolate, remember what he said to the Pharisees, your house shall be left to you desolate. If they knew that everything was going to be left desolate, if the temple was going to be leveled to the ground, that would be the end of their world. That would be the end of the Old Covenant age. So, of course, these disciples want to know when that age would end. This was a huge deal for them. Their age was the Mosaic age, the age of the Old Covenant, the law of Moses, and the prophets. So if you understand that all of those questions were related, then you will also hopefully begin to understand that when Jesus answered them, and from what we read in Matthew 24, he is actually telling them when it was going to happen. Now, I don't know how much you know about history, especially about the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. It's not something that people tend to get taught in schools. It doesn't even really get taught in churches. I've never heard it taught in a church, actually, or in a school. Doesn't mean that it doesn't happen, but not that I've ever heard of. So most people don't know about it. But if you dig into it a little bit, I highly recommend the writings of Josephus. There's also another book by George Peter Holford called The Destruction of Jerusalem. Definitely look into it. But what we would know then is that from history, we know that the Roman armies completely destroyed Judea. And they destroyed Jerusalem. Now, the Jewish-led zealots had a lot to do with the destruction of Jerusalem as well. It was not just the Roman armies. The Roman armies pretty much went in and they just finished things off. It was mostly the zealots doing in Jerusalem. But the temple, was destroyed in that siege of Jerusalem in AD 70. So Matthew 24 is about the things that would be happening in the coming years from when Jesus made his prophecies around AD 30 until the end, meaning the end of the age, came in AD 70. Now, I'm sure that most of you watching probably already know this, but if this is new to you, you may not know this, that a biblical generation was 40 years. And you can actually find this in Numbers. It might be Numbers 23:14. Don't quote me on that, though. I'm just trying to remember off the top of my head. But a biblical generation is 40 years. They likened it to the 40 years in the wilderness in the Exodus. So AD 30, Jesus made the prophecy of the temple's destruction. And Jesus gave a maximum of 40 years for his prophecy to come to pass. The prophecy meaning what he was speaking of in Matthew 24, and I would even say some of Matthew 25 as well. But he gave that time. He said, this generation shall not pass until all these things take place. And in all these things, he was talking about the destruction of the temple. He was talking about wars and rumors of wars, famines, earthquakes, the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, like all of these things, the sun darkening, the moon turning red, all of these things he said would happen in his generation. But remember, this whole conversation here started when they asked him when the temple was going to be destroyed, not one stone left upon another. He said in 30 AD that it would happen in their generation, so within 40 years' time. Well, 40 years later, in AD 70, the temple was completely destroyed, just as Jesus prophesied. How many people never heard that before? In fact, it was destroyed so thoroughly that it fulfilled Micah 3:12. Therefore, because of you, Zion shall be plowed as a field, Jerusalem shall become a heap of ruins, and the mountain of the house a wooded height. Now, regarding this prophecy in Micah, Glenn Hill shares that on page 43 of The Destruction of Jerusalem by George Peter Holford, he said, it is recorded in the Talmud and by Maimonides that Terentius Rufus, captain of the army of Titus, absolutely plowed up the foundation of the temple with a plowshare. So let's read Micah again. Therefore, because of you, Zion shall be plowed as a field. Jerusalem shall become a heap of ruins. Now, regarding that book, The Destruction of Jerusalem by Holford, I have a playlist called The Destruction of Jerusalem. I read that book out loud and I published the videos, so the entire book is right there on my playlist if you wanted to listen to it. It is amazing, and I don't know how anyone could listen to or read that book and not see the correlation between the Olivet Discourse and Revelation and what happened in the Jewish-Roman War. Now, one more thing that I want to point out here while I'm thinking of it is that when we're talking about the end of the age, to the Jews, it was not the end of the whole world. And I think I might have mentioned that before. That is not how they thought. That is how we think today. So we place our own perspectives on the Bible and think that that's what it says. But that is not even what the original audience would have ever thought. They never would have thought it was about the end of the material world and the material cosmos. To them, it was always about covenants. It was always about the end of the age. I believe I spoke about the Jewish historian Josephus earlier in this video. It might have been in the video that I recorded this before this one, but regardless, the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, in his book The Wars of the Jews, he said, and this is also from the book Christianity's Great Dilemma, Josephus said, the Roman general Titus decided to spare the temple from destruction. Titus felt that the temple was such a magnificent building that it should not be destroyed. He wanted to preserve it for the glory of the Roman Empire and as a monument to his and Rome's success. His order was for the temple not to be damaged. However, one of Titus's soldiers threw a firebrand through one of the temple's windows and set the holy structure ablaze. When word came to Titus, he rose up in great haste and ran to the holy house in order to have a stop put to the fire. He gave orders with a loud voice and gave signals with his right hand for his soldiers to quench the fire. But the normally highly trained and well-disciplined Roman legions were like wild madmen and made as if they did not so much as hear Caesar's orders, and with great passion continued to set it on fire. Then Glenhill points out, how awesome this history is. Does it not amaze you? The great Roman general and his tens of thousands of soldiers could not save the temple. Why? Because one greater than Titus, one greater than Caesar, even Jesus Christ, the Son of God, had said 40 years earlier, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. God had spoken, and General Titus could do nothing but follow his orders. And yet, despite Jesus' own words, and despite the correlation that we see in the scriptures with actual historical accounts of this time period, you will still have people telling you that Jesus did not do what he said he would do, and that his prophecies have not come to pass yet. In fact, as I was looking for images for this video, I found an image from a video that was calling Jesus' prophecy a false prophecy. And they actually highlighted him saying, this generation shall not pass away until all these things take place. That passage has been fuel for atheists to call Jesus a false prophet. And unfortunately, most Christians don't do anything to help with that because they are also saying the same thing, that he didn't come in his generation. So the atheists, they can see right through it. They can see through all of the excuses, and they know that those excuses are coming about out of desperation because people want their eschatology to be correct. But what is that doing to Jesus's character? I mean, he doesn't need us, okay, in any way, shape, or form. But what that is doing is fueling the fire for the atheists to call him a false prophet, to say that Christianity is not true. And that is going to hinder people from being saved because they're going to listen to the atheists, when in fact what we should be doing is shouting from the rooftops, Jesus did exactly what he said he was going to do, and he did it when he said he would do it. Like Glenhill says, his words are true, and he was indeed the Son of God. And, you know, when he spoke in the Olivet Discourse, I mentioned this earlier, he gave many signs of what was going to happen so that they would know what to look for. And I want to just point out that he said to them, when you see these signs, again, remember, pretend you're sitting in that audience when he said, when you see these signs, obviously you would think that he was talking to you because he would have been talking to you. You wouldn't have assumed that he was talking to an audience 2,000 years in the future. Okay? This is really important to understand. So if we're looking at the Olivet Discourse in verses 4, 5, and I'm just going to go through this quickly. I will link Matthew 24. I mean, I'm sure you have Bibles, but I'll link Matthew 24 in the description for the video too. I link all of the passages that I use. That way you can go through and read it for yourself, but I'm just going to go through it pretty quickly because we're already 30 minutes in. So in verses 4, 5, 11, 12, and 23 to 26, it speaks of many false prophets and false Christs would arise, deceiving many. In verses 6 and 7, it talks about wars, famines, pestilences, and earthquakes. In verses 9 and 10, it says that they, meaning the disciples, would be afflicted, betrayed, hated, and killed. Verse 12 says that many would leave the faith. Verse 14 says the gospel would be preached in all the world. Verses 15 to 20, when they saw the abomination of desolation, they should hurriedly flee from Judea to the mountains. And verses 21 and 22, there will be great tribulations, such as they had never known. Now, those signs were all seen by the disciples. And there is verification for that for most of these signs in the scriptures. And what there is not verification for in the scriptures, because it happened after the scriptures were written regarding the abomination of desolation, we actually have historical accounts for that. So it's really important to understand these things in their context, who it was actually written to. So let's just look at regarding the abomination of desolation. Luke 21, verses 20 and 21, it actually presents it for us in clearer words. The Jews would have known what abomination of desolation was. Luke was written to Gentiles, to Gentile Christians. So he wrote it in a different way so that they would understand. And what he said was, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, you will know that her desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those in the city get out, and let those in the country stay out of the city." So, of all the things that Jesus told his apostles to watch for, the army surrounding Jerusalem was a major sign. Well, history tells us that that is actually exactly what happened. Glenn Hill writes, "History tells us that in the mid-60s AD, the Romans attacked Judea and Jerusalem, and by AD 70 utterly destroyed them both along with the temple. More than 1 million Jews died, and the Romans took the survivors as slaves and prisoners of war. Their holy city, their houses and land, their holy temple, and their way of life as Jews were all totally and utterly destroyed. This was the judgment that Jesus had prophesied would come upon this generation." That was the one that he was telling to the Pharisees that we read earlier. This was the utter desolation he had predicted. The horrors and sufferings endured by the Jewish people during the years of this war fulfilled Jesus' prophecy of a time of great tribulation, such as never had been known. The history books about Jerusalem's fall attest to the unbelievable torments suffered by the Jewish people. Now, Glenn, he didn't share this in his book, but I've actually talked about this in several videos. We actually have another sure sign that this was the abomination that Jesus was speaking about when the armies were surrounding Jerusalem, because the Christians in 66 AD, when he was a Syrian governor, but he was also a Roman general. And his name was Gaius Cestius Gallus. He brought the Roman soldiers. They surrounded Jerusalem in 66 AD. Then for some unknown reason, which history books will even tell you, secular history books, they will tell you for some unknown reason, no one knows why, he retreated and they left. That gave the Christians in Jerusalem the opening to know that it was time to leave the city. Why? Because they were heeding Jesus' words in Luke 21, the ones that I just read to you. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, you will know that her desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those in the city get out, and let those in the country stay out of the city. The Christians, they saw that sign. They fled. They went to a place in Perea called Pella. What you will find is that 1.1 million Jews died in Jerusalem. There are no accounts of any Christians having been killed during this time period. Now, I will say that they retreated, and then in 70 AD, Titus, the Roman general Titus, he came, he surrounded it again, and then that was when they finished off Jerusalem. 1.1 million Jews died. No Christians died. Why? Because they heeded Jesus's warnings, and they fled, and they went to Perea. Pella, specifically. And there are so many other passages that just confirm that this was the time that Jesus was speaking of. In Luke 19, verses 41 to 44, it says, "And when he drew near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, Would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that make for peace. But now they are hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up a barricade around you and surround you and hem you in on every side and tear you down to the ground, you and your children within you. And they will not leave one stone upon another in you, because you did not know the time of your visitation." All of the things that Jesus just spoke of happened in the destruction of Jerusalem within his generation, 40 years after he said these things. Jesus had such a heart for Jerusalem, and he knew what was going to be coming upon them. Remember that when he went to Calvary, there were women who were weeping as he was going into Jerusalem. And it says he was filled with great compassion for the weeping women, how Jesus loved his people, how much he wanted to save them from the coming disaster. He knew what was coming. He knew what was going to be happening. So I'm hoping that if you came to this video, thinking to yourself that, what Jesus spoke of was all in the future, I'm hoping that you're starting to understand that they are not in our future. They were future to them, yes, to the people he was speaking to. It was future to them, yes, but it was future to them still in their generation. And these things, they're not just spoken of in Matthew 24. It's also in Mark 13 and Luke 21. And again, most people will say those things have not yet occurred. I'm hoping that I'm showing you different. And another thing that we need to think about is, as I mentioned, in Matthew 24, when he was speaking to his disciples in the Olivet Discourse, I just want to share with you some of the instructions that he gave to them that will hopefully help you to understand that he was talking to the people right there with him. He was not talking to us. He said to them, this is Matthew 24, I'm just going to share various verses. Well, I'll tell you which verse it was, just so you know. In verse 4, he said, "Take heed that no man deceive you." Verse 6, "And you shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled." Verse 9, "They shall deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and you shall be hated of all nations." Now, I want you to remember, these things all happened in their time period. How many of Jesus's disciples and apostles and believers were martyred in the time period up to the destruction of the temple? In verse 15, "When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation." Remember, that should give you, in my opinion, a huge clue, because he said, when you see the abomination of desolation, that was when he was talking about fleeing Jerusalem, when the army surrounded. That's what happened in 66 AD. So obviously when he said you, he meant you. Verse 16, "Then let them which be in Judea," not us in America. He said, "them which be in Judea, flee unto the mountains." And they did. The Christians fled to Pella. Now, another thing to point out here is that If the Bible is talking about the end of the world, how would fleeing to the mountains help? I don't think that Jesus would tell his followers to flee to the mountains unless it was actually going to help them. If this was a cataclysmic end-of-world event, fleeing to the mountains would not have done anything, and Jesus would not have told his believer or his followers to do that, in my opinion, but I'm sure that most of you would agree with me there. And then he said to them in verse 33, "So likewise you, when you shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors." Doors of the temple, by the way. That's what it means. He emphasized you here. So likewise you, when you see all these things. Pointing out you. He was talking to them. And I'm sure there are still some of you watching who are fighting this tooth and nail and are still insisting that he was not speaking to the people who were there with him. I want to share with you something that Glenn Hill said. He said this very well. What else could Jesus have said to have made these statements any more personally related to his apostles, to their lives, and to their age? His words were all about them. Okay, my throat is giving out on me. So, let's go to Matthew 24. We're going to read verses 32 to 33. And Jesus gave his disciples a very short parable here that we're going to read, and then we're just going to very shortly discuss this. From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away. So, in verses 32 and 33, I think it's really important to point out, so many people think this is talking about Israel. There's not a single word here said about Israel. There's absolutely no reason to believe that. What this is referring to is that when they saw a fig tree put out its tender leaves, they knew that summer was near. So when Jesus told his disciples likewise that when they began to see these signs come to pass, then they would know that it is near, even at the doors. So what were the things? When all of these things that Jesus had been talking to his disciples and giving him all of these signs that they were supposed to look for, what were the things that would be near to happening? Well, the judgment on Judah would be near. The desolation of their nation would be near. The destruction of their temple. The end of the old covenant age, which was the world about which they had asked, would be near. And the return of Jesus, his second coming, would be near. On page 26, Glenn Hill says, if we look back at the scriptures with which we began, we see Jesus' first answer in verse 30. He said, "Then they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory." And that will be right here. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Now, it is important to point out here, so many people imagine him coming on a cumulus clouds. That's not what coming on the clouds means. Coming on the clouds is a Hebraic idiom. It's used, there are similar phrases used throughout the Old Testament. For example, in, I believe it's Isaiah 19:1, where in the judgment on Egypt, it says that Yahweh was riding on a swift cloud. Okay. And most people will say, well, yeah, that's using figurative language, but for some reason they don't understand that this is also figurative language. So when it says that he was coming on the clouds, it meant power, it meant glory. It also meant judgment. Coming on the clouds would mean judgment. So again, not literal clouds. But anyway, so Jesus was in the midst of talking about the signs that would precede the destruction of Jerusalem, the armies that would destroy the city and the temple, the misery and sufferings of the people in these times, and the arising of false Christs and false prophets. While talking about these things, Jesus said, then meaning in the time frame of all these other events, he would come back. So then, according to Glenn Hill, it says, we have found the answer to our questions. Jesus said he would come in the time of the fulfillment of the prophecies he had made about the judgment of God on the nation of Judah. In the time when these other events were occurring or had occurred, then he would return. The word then puts his coming in the same time frame as the coming of the armies that destroyed the temple, which he had foretold in Matthew 24. Again, we know from history that the temple was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. So, that's something to think about, isn't it? Might come as a surprise to you, but the New Testament actually agrees with this answer. So then, you just have to ask yourself, how much clearer could Jesus have been when he told the apostles when his prophecies would occur and when he would return? He gave them so many details. The major thing to look for was the armies surrounding Jerusalem. But once they saw these armies surrounding Jerusalem, they would know that then they should flee to the mountains. That's verse 16. Then there would be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning, verse 21. Then would be false prophets, and if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect, verse 24. And then Jesus would come again with power and great glory. This is verse 30. Remember that once these armies surrounded Jerusalem, these things would be happening at a fever pitch. Let's see. Once the Roman armies arrived, then would begin a series of events culminating with the parousia. These armies arrived in the 60s and finished their destruction in AD 70. Let's see. And then it says, in case any questions remained among his apostles about when he would come back, Jesus added a final, all-inclusive and plain time statement. In verse 34, he said, "Truly I say to you, this generation shall not pass away until all these things take place." This generation was the generation of people that Jesus gave these signs to. This video went a lot longer than I thought it was going to, so let me just bring this all together just by saying that if we trust what Jesus said, we know that he wasn't a liar. We know that he wasn't a false prophet. We know that we can trust him and we can believe his words, and we should not fall for mental gymnastics that need to be used in order to pretend that he didn't say what he actually said. There is no other way that he couldn't have been more clear. Let's just put it that way. So, I know there are so many, this is a picture, signs of the last days. This generation shall not pass. Again, took the word this and somehow foisted it onto a generation 2,000 years after Jesus said that. And so this obviously, I'm sure where this came from had something to do with the state of Israel becoming a nation. So many people think that is when they call that the fig tree generation, and they think that was the sign. I'm not going to get into this in this video, but there are no prophecies in the Bible of unbelieving Israel being gathered back together. It's just not in there. The state of Israel, as it is today, doesn't have anything to do with Bible prophecy. Jesus meant this generation. Not this generation as in ours. He meant this generation as in his generation. Anyway, that's all that I have for you today. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed and would like to hear more of what I have to say, I would love if you would do that. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them down below. And if you like my work and would like to become a channel member, I will leave a link in the description box for that as well, or you can just click on it right on my channel page. And I hope you have a great day.